Preparation for 2023 fantasy football drafts. That's what we're talking about on today's RotoViz OT. We had a listener question that came in around some stacking options. We're going to get into that in a moment and talk through that. I'm interested to get Shawn's thoughts. We also are going to talk some of the first round options and maybe what our preferred spot is when we're drafting in those first 12 picks, who we would like to have. So excited for that coming up. Shawn, today's show should be a fun one.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. We have done quite a bit of free agency content recently. We are hip deep in the Dynasty Reanimators series, and that's been a lot of fun and also a listener favorite. So, Colm, I can't wait to get back to that later in the week. And as we go through this just extremely exciting month leading up to the 2023 NFL draft. But yeah, we're going to get back to fantasy drafting today, do a little bit of Underdog. You mentioned it'll be the little board we've drafted and the big board, both of these pre-NFL draft contests for Underdog. So much fun because you don't know where the guys are going yet. You do know that quite a few rookies are going to skyrocket after the draft. Of course, if you hit the wrong ones, they can fall a little bit too. That part of it is fun. We have a whole bunch of structural questions that we'll be looking at and trying to solve the puzzle for. We did an FFPC Listener League draft before you went on vacation. That was a lot of fun. We had 11 of our hardcore OT fanatics in that one. That one is super flex. This one, a regular draft column. You look at the top of the board here in terms of ADP, you see exciting names like Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase. I think we've been predicting for a while that those guys would be the players at the top of the 2023 board. It is wide receiver heavy now. People have finally arrived. We know that Zero RB won the $1 million regular season prize last year. Congratulations again to King Cap on that. Just a fantastic outcome. And now that Zero RB has taken down one of the biggest prizes in the history of fantasy football, maybe that makes it a little bit easier for some skeptical drafters to jump in. But Colm, we don't need any convincing.
Yeah, I don't think we need any convincing. And you mentioned, skeptical drafters. I think there's going to be pushback, Shawn. I think there's always going to be the people who do want to get on board and say it's a once-off or say for whatever different excuses. But yeah, shout out to King Cap, as you mentioned. One of the questions, Shawn, that did come in over the last couple of days is around mainly redraft, but it really fits in when we're looking at best ball too. And that is, one side of it is correlation and the other side of it is stacking offenses together. Now, it's very hard if you're talking about, correlation in terms of last year when we get to knowing where some of these rookies land. We know the entire fixture schedule. You can go ahead and try and correlate those week 17 games, for example, but that isn't going to be really possible at this time of the year with a number of the scenarios that we'll be talking through. But in terms of redraft or best ball, because I think they're getting closer and closer to the strategy wise to what people are trying to do. How are you on stacking at this point? I know it was something that we talked in some of these best ball tournaments a couple of years ago, and you mentioned that it may not be as important as some people will make it out to be. But I think it's beneficial if you can make it work and that the players are at the correct prices and you can link those in together. But what's your thoughts entering 2023 on the importance or the lack thereof and stacking on your best ball rosters or your redraft rosters?
Yeah, this is an interesting one because you can pull up the RotoViz Underdog Advanced Rate Explorer and mess around with just a crazy amount of information. And one of the things that you can explore in that tool is stacking using, not surprisingly, the Stacking Explorer. And you will see for 2022 that this combination of QB and wide receiver was very effective in terms of getting drafters through. We also know that Patton winning the $2 million in the final week there has this sort of sneaky stack / correlation play where he's going with that Buccaneers Panthers game, gets the monster performance from Tom Brady. Perhaps surprisingly has Chris Godwin, not the big scorer in that game. That would be Mike Evans, obviously, because Evans is not going to have advanced nearly as many teams through. You don't have that guy being the winner. And I think that most people, when they look at that, they're going to say, okay, well, it must have been a Brady and Evans than with DJ Moore, which was also in the mix there, that made that work, and yet it wasn't. So one of the things that you really are coming back to is that it's Tom Brady who got that done. And then you do have it pulling DJ Moore through a little bit. And that was one of the games where the Panthers were actually able to get him some points and they compete in that shootout. So you're going to see some potential benefits there. We also are going to have the thing where you look back at the team that won and say, well, it worked in this case, and so we want to chase that. The thing that I just always recommend to drafters is to don't give away a ton of points in order to force some of these elements onto your teams, especially if you're not going to be playing hundreds of teams. That type of approach is going to work the best for drafters who have massive, massive portfolios and can afford to force a lot of those on individual teams because they're going to get all of the different players. They're going to get all the different players at decent prices as they work through and have this built out and have just so much depth of preparation for it. If you're going to be drafting 5-10 teams, then you want to be much more careful in terms of making sure you're getting good values and making sure you're getting the players that you want. You want to build a team like King Captain, and not to say that he didn't use some of those elements as well, but you want to build a superpower as opposed to building a very fragile team with some of those elements mixed in. And then especially once we take it to redraft, where you're looking at, in most cases, beating a league with 11 other players, you're not necessarily looking for week 17 and how can we have a team that scores in, the 99.9 percentile to win a contest that has 500,000 participants. We're trying to figure out how to win a league that has 11 players and 11 other players besides yourself. And so the key there is, again, to build the best team that you can. There may be quite a few cases where you have an undervalued QB target. And one of the things that, again, pops out with Pat's victory there, and also with King Cap's just power team, is that you have so much talk about these very, very top guys. And, how much do you want to pay for Josh Allen? How much do you want to pay for Patrick Mahomes? The guys who dominated in the power team for King Cap were Jalen Hurts and Joe Burrow, two of the three players that we really strongly argued for in the QB window. And then Tom Brady is actually a guy who's at the very back of the QB window and is more this passing matchup guy where, you're hoping that the combination of Brady with a Godwin or an Evans is going to blow up and win you the tournament. But you're also just kind of hoping that Tom Brady had scored more points throughout the course of the season, right? So as I'm looking at these teams and team construction, one of the things that I would encourage people to at least consider at the QB position, and then that has obviously cascade effects as you work down through what some of these stacks and correlation plays are going to look like, would be to, again, not force it, but consider taking an inexpensive run-oriented QB, ideally in the window, and then to pair them with one of these less expensive pass-oriented QBs where the overall win rate and advance rate probably isn't going to be through the roof. The overall scoring level is probably not going to be through the roof, but they can work in concert with that Konami code QB to get to that point and then create options, create pathways for, in the key moments, to have a big score with that QB and the receiver. One of the other players who just in an ideal world would have been an absolute monster last year. And again, you're talking about somebody who's at the back end of the QB window, would have been Tua, and you have Tua with Tyreek Hill, Tua with Jalen Waddle. I mean, an absolutely fantastic play there. The unfortunate thing, and one of the things that was a big storyline in 2022 and a very frustrating storyline, was just the extreme rate of QB injuries and how that took out so many of the cool plays. But that's something I'm looking at for 2023. It's something that I'll be writing about at some length as we kind of go through the process. Yeah, you want to set your team up to have these avenues to really, really high scores. Just, Colm, as you mentioned it is important to not cannibalize the value of your roster as you're going through and doing that. And that's important too, just in terms of a mental flexibility perspective as you prepare and as you execute the draft. try not to get too locked into things like that. And then there are other things you're also trying to not get too locked into when we talk about structure and having that limit you as opposed to amplify your good decisions. That mental flexibility as you go through the drafts, that's always the key. Where would you like to be as we look at this first round? And obviously, it's not just the first round. It's where you end up with your selection in the second round. And again, kind of the flexibility that you get. You'd love to get Justin Jefferson. You'd love to get Jamar Chase. And yet, if you're in the middle of the draft, not only have we historically seen very high win rates through there, but you're able to get falling values. You don't have to be as worried that you're going to be hit by a positional run as you are at the corners. And yet, Colm, I do have to say that throughout the years of drafting, and it's about 15 of those years playing high stakes at this point, it's crazy to think that the first tournament that I entered back in 2008 was back that long ago. 2008, not just the other day at this point. But thinking through all of those thousands of drafts, I like to be at the turn and be able to make two picks at once. It feels like when you have those two selections, you can't really put pressure on your opponents because they still have all the rest of the players to choose from. But getting to grab two guys, that part is fun. It does make it a little bit easier to record because then you have all the way back around to discuss what people are doing, your own selections, that type of thing. And yet probably not the strongest positions, especially when we think about position 11, position 12. Although I think, Colm, maybe one of the things I'm the most proud of with site content over the past couple of years is that we've done several articles looking at what you can do out of 11, what you can do out of 12, bringing in multiple tools from the site, looking at Blair's Win the Flex tool, looking at the sim score tools, the range of outcome tool that Dave Caban does such a nice job putting together, and discussing what you need to do. We can look at the Best Ball Win Rate Explorer and see what mistakes people are making, how we can avoid those. Again, a little bit of an advertisement for the tools there, because when you put two or three tools together and really focus them on a specific and important question, they have some incredible answers for you. Look, where would you like to be here? Who do you not have so far early on in 2023 that we would have a great first round draft slot to go ahead and go get?
Well, any of the drafts, Shawn, that I've done so far have been, we've recorded them, so they've kind of all been with you. So we've not done a huge amount from that perspective in terms of volume this year on my side. When I'm looking at the options, though, here, particularly at Underdog, it feels like as much as I want to have either Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase, I'm kind of feel like quite happy if I'm in that like 6, 7, 8 range, because you are going to get a pretty high level player unless you're at 1 or 2. I think then the Christian McCaffrey all the way down to say Stefon Diggs in terms of ADP here with Kupp, Hill, Kelsey, Diggs. I think there's a lot of interesting names, and then if you are picking further back towards the end of the round, there's more chance that second player that you pick up is also going to be of a higher standard as you would expect with it being a higher ADP. But I'm kind of, I know as we do more drafts, I'll want to get some of the 101s, 102s, but I'm quite comfortable if we're in that 7, 8 kind of range with our boy AJ Brown there, Davante Adams, CeeDee Lamb, Jonathan Taylor, Bijan Robinson, even Saquon Barkley. I'd be happy to get 2 of that list rather than to just go on and get the 101, 102 and see who's there at the 2-3 turn. How are you feeling at this point?
Well, I mean, I'd love to get Justin Jefferson.
Yeah, we would obviously love that. But it's kind of like, do you feel how I mentioned, if it's not the 101 or the 102, there isn't as much of a tier break really then, I don't think, to maybe early second round?
Yeah, I have it pretty flat. I mean, Garrett Wilson, Jalen Waddle, those guys have ADPs around 15, around 18. I mean, you wouldn't want to take them in the first round, and yet there's an extremely high likelihood that they're going to score with a Stefon Diggs, score with an AJ Brown, probably outscore Davante Adams. So from that perspective, if you can get the foundation running back and then grab a lot of those guys. One of the things that we see, though, in 2023 and the year of the wide receiver avalanche and the year where people have tumbled to the fact that you have to have that wide receiver core to start these drafts, even if you're not as excited about some of the possibilities for first round wide receiver, even someone like Cooper Kupp, who is still a no-brainer. When you have a guy who is older, who probably wasn't the best athlete in the NFL to start with, has had some injuries, even though they should be in no way debilitating injuries. But I mean, you think about some of the guys, in recent history who had injuries that didn't seem necessarily that debilitating. I mean, David Johnson didn't seem like he was going to be done. Michael Thomas didn't seem like he was going to be done. You have flukes in both directions. You have some of these guys who come back and have astonishing recovery from injury. And then you have situations that seem like they wouldn't be much and do create a problem. And then with Cooper Kupp, obviously you have the Matthew Stafford situation on top of that. Colm, when we do our Dynasty Reanimator episode coming up later in the week, we have a big trade that we were able to execute. We got a good offer. We accepted that offer as opposed to countering. It does take us further into the Sam Howell 100% rostership club. And so you always like that. But Matthew Stafford, a little bit of risk. I think that he's going to have a good season. Tyreek Hill, the next wide receiver there, I think he's going to have a fantastic season. We mentioned Tua, probably the best value in fantasy drafts of any player right now. And yet a lot of that value comes from the fact that there is some risk there. And you think about someone like a Brandon Cooks, who a couple of years ago looked like his career probably was over or was at least on the brink. And then just so thankfully, he's been able to avoid those concussions, or at least apparently avoid the concussions for a really long stretch now. And so you're hoping that Brandon Cooks can stay healthy, can play well for the Cowboys, can make it through the rest of his career without any other head injuries. Obviously, we were rooting the same thing for Tua. If he stays healthy, his value, pretty crazy. You look at Stefon Diggs. I mean, I love Stefon Diggs, but this price doesn't seem to consider how his season ended and the threat of a DeAndre Hopkins being added. In my personal preference column, I don't think it's any surprise that when you look at him, you look at where he is in his career, you look at some of the contract issues, and you're thinking, well, who's going to be most interested in DeAndre Hopkins? Well, it's all 32 teams. But the fact that the Buffalo Bills and the Kansas City Chiefs, two of the teams linked to him, there's no surprise there. Now, the unfortunate thing is that the Chiefs are going to be always butting up against the salary cap because they do spend intelligently to the limit in order to fill that team out around Patrick Mahomes with his contract and with the fact that they have multiple other superstars. You have Travis Kelce, you have actually some of the best defensive players in the NFL. You're working to build that offensive line. So they're going to always be up against the limit. And yet you look at that and you're thinking, there's going to be a little bit of negotiating stance in there. The longer he stays out there, the more time it gives Kansas City a chance to figure out a way to either negotiate with him something that would work, to restructure a few contracts to make it work. Anyway, this is just more that people already know, which is that I love DeAndre Hopkins and obviously I'm from Kansas City. So if they could make that match, that would be, well, Colorado would just be so exciting. But you do have the connection here between the Bills and DeAndre Hopkins. That's going to crush Gabe Davis's value, at least in the short term. It probably should have a little bit of effect on Stefon Diggs. With A.J. Brown, you have the run-oriented offense. With Davante Adams, you have, I don't know if we have a QB downgrade. There are all kinds of advanced stats surrounding Jimmy Garoppolo that are at least encouraging. And Blair Andrews has a fantastic article on him up on the site looking at his move to the Las Vegas Raiders. And yet, Jimmy Garoppolo is not a star. He's not Davante Adams' college teammate. They moved Darren Waller. They bring in Jacoby Myers. This is a little rich for Davante Adams, wouldn't you say?
I know we all know what Davante Adams can do. I think that I feel like Davante Adams is quarterback proof at this point. It doesn't matter who's going to be there. And I know you like Derek Carr, and I know I'm not the biggest fan of Jimmy G, but I also think it's probably close to a fair quarterback swap there in terms of what he's going to get. So I think we'll get the targets, and I think we'll get the volume, and that's probably going to be enough to get Davante Adams over the line. I do feel, again, the one thing I'm a little less comfortable with when it comes to the wide receivers in terms of their ADP this year is the amount of veteran wide receivers in that, kind of top 8 of the wide receivers. And I mean veteran by, over 30 or approaching 30. You mentioned DeAndre Hopkins. Some of these guys aren't that much younger than DeAndre Hopkins as we move forward here. So that will be my one concern is we do think we're going to see these guys continue the elite level play for multiple more years, but there's also that possibility with the quarterback change. Maybe that rapport isn't as good as I'm saying in terms of being quarterback proof. And maybe we do see those numbers drop quite drastically. When you're wide receiver 7 going in the back end of the first round for Davante Adams here, I think similar to what you mentioned with Stefon Diggs, it does have a number of risks around it. And if we're talking about, when we look at running backs, we talk about the risks around them. I do think there is risks around the veteran wide receivers going here in the first round. And that is one of the other reasons why if you can get Jefferson or Chase in that first or second pick, it obviously gives you an edge there that you don't have to worry about it. But we are looking at, Diggs is there, Hill's there, Adams is there. There's a Cup is there, a lot of veterans in that range. So bodies start to break down as people age and so on and so forth. And hopefully that isn't the case, but yeah, definitely have some concern, Shawn.
You mentioned the age, and I think that a lot of times listeners are going to think that maybe there's too much emphasis on that, especially too much emphasis in redraft. That feels a little bit more the case after a season like 2022, where most of the players who were relied upon early, they came through. And we didn't see a lot of people falling off the cliff from these early draft slots. Now, you do have a decline for Dalvin Cook. You have a decline from Alvin Kamara that is in some ways a little bit more contextual than it does appear to be age-related because his actual performance was still fantastic. I think especially after you have a season that creates a little bit of a more aggressive narrative in a certain direction, that you want to be very careful about chasing that. You've got to continue to look at a bigger picture. What are the 3-year trends? What are the 5-year trends? What are the 10-year trends? Sifting out things that have very clearly changed in terms of how the NFL calls plays, how fantasy players score points. You have to understand the way things are changing and not ignore those. But when you're looking at something like an age-related element for players, you want to look at what the risks are there. And you prefer to be out on a player a year early as opposed to a year late, unless that player is already being discounted because of a perceived risk. Davante Adams being drafted with an ADP around 10, you could claim that there probably is a little bit of an age-related discount there because he was so dynamic last season. We pull up the weekly tool and you look at where he is in terms of leading the NFL with 14 touchdowns. He has 1,400 yards. He has over 2,000 air yards, one of only a couple of receivers to do that. And so you're looking at a player who came through at a very high level last season. Maybe that's already appropriately factored in. When you have someone with a 33% target share, my thought here would be the next player drafted is a CeeDee Lamb, a player who gets up there with 9 touchdowns, has 1,359 yards, 29% target share. He has that target depth of just over 10 that puts you in that range where you're an all-around player, has almost 500 yards after the catch. So you have a before catch dynamo, you have an after the catch strength, you have a rising player who anybody could get hurt, but you're not going to have an age-based collapse with a CeeDee Lamb. You have now Brandon Cooks there who could siphon some targets, but when you look at where they were last season and how weak they were at the other receiving positions, and when you look at Dalton Schultz moving on and not being there as the safety blanket, I would suggest that the main thing that's going to happen with a CeeDee Lamb is that Brandon Cooks is going to limit a little bit of that defensive attention, make it so it's a little bit more difficult to run gimmick defenses, a little bit more difficult to have constant double teams. As long as you retain some of the creativity in the offense, I mean, Lamb should do well. Now, there is some concern too when you look at the change of the play caller there. I think that that's more likely to hurt the overall offense than it is to hurt CeeDee Lamb specifically.
So thanks, Shawn. That was a fun discussion around both. We started off on the stacking and correlation discussion. Then we moved into the first round options here in 2023 on UnderdogFantasy.com. We will be doing a draft in the little board, which is available over at Underdog Fantasy. Once again, if you are signing up, you can use the code RotoViz to get yourself a 100% sign-up bonus up to $100. Hopefully, you'll have some fun doing the drafts, and hopefully, you're going to have some fun listening to us draft. That is going to be the Wednesday edition of the RotoViz Overtime podcast. Shawn, as we get ready to finish up today's show, any other thoughts to share with the OT community?
We just wanted to throw out again that we appreciate so much the feedback and the engagement on the Dynasty Reanimator series. Check some of those episodes out. Send us your questions. We've got multiple questions that are out there simmering that we are going to use for content coming up. There are orphan teams out there that you can go purchase. We're going to have so much content on the draft and on other Dynasty elements over the next month. So make sure you head on over and get yourself that month-long subscription if you just want to try it out for a limited period of time, see what it has. Part 2, or I should say volume 2 of the RotoViz Rookie Guide is out there right now. We had an absolute blast putting that together. It has advanced stats and how to think about the numbers that matter, the stats that matter at different positions. And then it has multiple mock drafts. It has our rookie rankings. So that was a lot of fun. That's available. Colm, this is just such a great time of year. As free agency has calmed down a little bit, you get a chance to breathe just a tad bit. And yet at the same time, there are so many different types of elements going on. We're enjoying all of those over at the site. We're enjoying them on the shows. And yeah, I can't wait to do this Underdog draft. We'll see people back here soon.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of the feedback from the RotoViz OT community. I have to say, over the last I would say maybe 2 months, the season has obviously died down. People maybe aren't as invested in the teams, and more so they're listening to the content and giving questions, giving feedback. And we've answered some of those questions. We have some simmering, as you mentioned, but it has been tremendous to interact with the listeners of the show, and to hear that they were delighted that a question might have been answered while they're driving to work, for example, and they've got to listen in. So things like that. When we record this, Shawn, you're in Arizona, I'm over here in Ireland. We're talking to each other over streaming service, and sometimes you don't think about the back end where people are listening and people are getting the enjoyment out of listening. So we do want to say that we appreciate each and every one of you, and having those interactions over the last couple of months and over the last couple of years, in all honesty. But it seems to have ramped up and increased in volume over the last couple of months, which, Shawn, that's probably good in terms of people listening to the show. So thanks to everyone tuning in. We will be back on Wednesday with another episode of RotoViz OT when we are drafting over at Underdog. So you'll hear who we are making those selections. We talked through some of the options today. And until we are back then, have a good one.